On the morning of June 17th, 1981, at approximately 9:42 a.m., a maintenance worker named Dennis Kowalski discovered a small metal canister wedged beneath a wooden bench in Battery Park, at the southern tip of Manhattan. Before we explore how this single discovery exposed an entire Soviet spy network operating inside America, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these forgotten cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. Now, back to that canister. The weather that day was warm and humid, with a haze hanging over the harbor that obscured the Statue of Liberty in the distance. Kowalski, 56 years old, had worked for the New York City Parks Department for 23 years. His job that morning was routine: emptying trash receptacles, checking for vandalism, performing minor repairs to park infrastructure. The bench where he found the canister sat along a walking path that offered views of the water, a spot where office workers ate lunch and tourists stopped to rest between visits to the nearby ferry terminal. The canister itself was unremarkable in appearance, approximately 2 inches in length, 3/4 of an inch in diameter, made of what appeared to be stainless steel with a screw-top cap. Kowalski initially assumed it was trash, perhaps a container for film or a small battery. But something about the way it had been wedged beneath the bench, deliberately placed in a specific location where it would not be immediately visible but could be retrieved by someone who knew where to look, struck him as unusual. He had seen drug dealers use similar hiding spots for their transactions, and his first thought was that the canister might contain narcotics. Kowalski brought the canister to the Parks Department supervisor's office in the Park Maintenance Building on State Street. The supervisor, a man named Robert Chen, examined it and agreed that it seemed suspicious. Rather than opening it themselves, they decided to contact the New York Police Department. At 11:15 a.m., 2 patrol officers arrived to collect the canister. They logged it as found property and transported it to the 1st Precinct Station House on Erickson Place. The canister sat in the precinct's evidence room for 2 days. On June 19th, 1981, Detective Maria Esposito, who had been assigned to review accumulated evidence from various cases, opened the canister expecting to find drugs or possibly stolen jewelry. Instead, she found what appeared to be a tightly rolled strip of photographic film, approximately 6 inches in length when unrolled. The film was extremely fine-grained, much finer than ordinary camera film, and the images on it were too small to see clearly with the naked eye. Esposito had worked in the NYPD for 12 years, including 3 years in the Intelligence Division before transferring to major crimes. She recognized the film as likely being microfilm, a technology used to photograph documents at greatly reduced size for storage or transmission. Microfilm had legitimate commercial uses, but Esposito's training in the Intelligence Division had also taught her that it was frequently used for espionage purposes. A small strip of microfilm could contain dozens or even hundreds of pages of photographed documents. Esposito contacted the FBI's New York field office that same afternoon. She spoke with Special Agent Thomas Garrett, who worked in the counterintelligence section. Garrett, 41 years old, had been investigating Soviet intelligence operations in New York for 7 years. When Esposito described the canister and its contents, Garrett asked her to secure the film and not to expose it to light or attempt any further examination. He arrived at the precinct within an hour to collect the evidence personally. The FBI's standard procedure for examining recovered microfilm involved transporting it to the Bureau's Technical Services Laboratory, located at that time in a secure facility in Washington, D.C. However, the New York field office maintained its own photographic laboratory capable of preliminary analysis. On the afternoon of June 19, 1981, FBI technician Laura Chen examined the microfilm under magnification in a dark room environment designed to prevent any light damage to the images. What Chen found was a strip of microfilm containing 17 frames. Each frame appeared to be a photograph of a typewritten document. The text was in English, but portions of it used what Chen recognized as coded language, words and phrases that appeared to be substitution codes or references to operations and individuals using cover names rather than real identities. Chen photographed each frame using specialized equipment that could enlarge the microfilm images to readable size, producing a set of full-sized prints that could be examined and analyzed. The 17 photographed documents, when enlarged and printed, revealed what appeared to be operational instructions and intelligence reports related to Soviet espionage activities in the United States. The first document was dated May 1981, just 6 weeks before the canister was discovered. It contained instructions for what intelligence professionals call dead drop operations, the practice of leaving information or materials at a prearranged location where they could be retrieved by another person without direct contact between the two individuals. The document specified several locations in New York City where dead drops could be established, including Battery Park, Central Park near Bethesda Fountain, and a location in Queens near Flushing Meadows Park. Each location was described with precise details, specific benches, particular trees, distinctive landmarks that would allow someone to identify the exact spot without ambiguity. The document also specified timing protocols, what days of the week were acceptable, what times of day minimized the risk of observation, and what signals would indicate whether a drop had been made or retrieved successfully. A second document on the microfilm contained biographical information about 3 individuals identified only by code names: professor, engineer, and diplomat. The information included their ages, their professional backgrounds, their access to classified or sensitive information, their personal circumstances, and assessments of their motivations for cooperating with Soviet intelligence. The level of details suggested these were not hypothetical profiles, but descriptions of actual people who were either already cooperating with the Soviets or were being considered for recruitment. The profile designated engineer was particularly detailed. This individual was described as a 43-year-old man who worked for a defense contractor in New Jersey, specializing in radar and communications systems for military aircraft. He held a security clearance that gave him access to classified technical specifications and design documents. The profile noted that he was experiencing financial difficulties related to medical expenses for a family member, and that he had expressed political views critical of U.S. foreign policy during conversations that had been monitored or reported. The document assessed him as receptive to approach and recommended that initial contact be made through what it called a false flag operation, an approach in which the recruiter would pretend to represent a different organization or cause rather than revealing Soviet sponsorship immediately. The profile designated professor described a 51-year-old academic who taught international relations at a university in the Boston area. This individual had traveled to the Soviet Union as part of academic exchange programs and had established relationships with Soviet scholars who were, the document suggested, actually intelligence officers. The profile noted that Professor had access to information about U.S. government policy-making processes through contacts in Washington and through participation in think tanks and advisory committees. The assessment was that Professor was providing information willingly, believing it contributed to scholarly exchange and improved U.S.-Soviet understanding without realizing that the information was being used for intelligence purposes. The profile designated diplomat was more fragmentary, suggesting either that less was known about this individual or that the document was incomplete. It indicated that diplomat was someone with access to State Department communications and policy discussions, possibly a mid-level Foreign Service officer, or someone in a support role with access to classified cable traffic. Other documents on the microfilm included what appeared to be intelligence reports, summaries of information that had already been collected and transmitted to Soviet intelligence headquarters. One report discussed U.S. Navy operations in the Atlantic, including details about submarine patrol patterns and communications protocols. Another report concerned NATO military exercises scheduled for later in 1981, including information about participating forces, planned scenarios, and command structures. A third report dealt with U.S. positions in ongoing arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union, including internal assessments of which positions were negotiable and which were considered non-negotiable by U.S. negotiators. The documents also contained evidence of how the information was being transmitted. Several references were made to Center, which FBI analysts understood to be Moscow Center, the headquarters of the KGB's first chief directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence operations. The documents used terminology and formatting that was consistent with KGB operational communications that the FBI had seen in previous counterintelligence investigations. By June 22, 1981, 3 days after the microfilm was discovered, the FBI had completed its preliminary analysis and had determined that the material represented significant evidence of an active Soviet intelligence operation. The question was who had placed the canister in Battery Park, who was supposed to retrieve it, and who the individuals designated as professor, engineer, and diplomat actually were. The FBI's investigation, designated Operation FILMSTRIP, began with surveillance of the Battery Park location where the canister had been found. Agents, working in shifts and using various forms of cover, joggers, tourists, office workers on lunch breaks, maintenance personnel, maintained observation of the bench and the surrounding area. The theory was that whoever had placed the canister might return, either to check whether it had been retrieved or to leave additional materials at the same location. For 2 weeks, the surveillance produced nothing unusual. The bench was used by dozens of people each day: tourists, park visitors, people eating lunch, couples meeting. Agents photographed everyone who sat on the bench or passed near it, building a database of faces and identifying anyone who appeared repeatedly. On July 7, 1981, surveillance agents observed a man who appeared to take unusual interest in the bench. The man, who appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s, approached the bench at approximately 1:15 p.m. He did not sit down but stopped near it, appeared to look around as if checking whether he was being observed, and then reached beneath the bench in approximately the location where the canister had been wedged. Finding nothing, he appeared momentarily confused or concerned. He checked his watch, looked around again, and then walked away quickly, heading north through the park toward Broadway. Agents tracked the man as he walked approximately 6 blocks to a subway station, descended to the platform, and boarded a northbound 4 train. Surveillance teams boarded the same train car and others boarded adjacent cars, maintaining visual contact. The man rode the train to the 59th Street station, transferred to the N train, and rode to the Astoria Boulevard station in Queens. From there, he walked approximately 8 blocks to a residential neighborhood and entered an apartment building on 31st Street. Building records identified the man as Viktor Leonidovich Sokolov, a 38-year-old Soviet citizen who worked at the United Nations as a translator in the Department of Conference Services. UN employment records showed Sokolov had been working at the UN since 1978. He held a Soviet diplomatic passport, which meant he enjoyed certain immunities under international law. The FBI already had a file on Sokolov. He had been identified 2 years earlier as a person of interest based on analysis of Soviet personnel at the UN. The FBI maintained a comprehensive database of Soviet and Eastern Bloc nationals working at the UN, assessing which ones were likely intelligence officers operating under diplomatic or official cover. Sokolov's profile suggested he might be more than just a translator. His background included service in the Soviet Army in what appeared to be an intelligence unit. His travel patterns showed trips outside New York that seemed inconsistent with his UN duties, and intercepted communications from the Soviet UN mission had referenced a VL in contexts that suggested intelligence activities. The discovery that Sokolov had checked the Battery Park dead drop site, looking for something that was no longer there, strongly suggested that he was involved in the operation documented in the microfilm. The question was whether he had placed the canister there or was supposed to retrieve it, and who his contacts were. The FBI expanded surveillance to include comprehensive coverage of Sokolov's activities. Agents documented his movements to and from work, his contacts with other Soviet personnel, his trips around New York, and his communications. The FBI also obtained authorization to place electronic listening devices in his apartment, though this required careful coordination with the Justice Department, given Sokolov's diplomatic status and the legal protections that afforded. Over the following weeks, surveillance revealed that Sokolov was maintaining a pattern of activity that appeared designed to detect whether he was being followed. He would take circuitous routes when traveling, would make sudden changes in direction or mode of transportation, would stop unexpectedly, as if to check whether anyone behind him also stopped. These were classic counter-surveillance techniques taught to intelligence officers to help them identify when they were under observation. On July 28, 1981, Sokolov left his apartment building at approximately 7:45 p.m., and began what FBI agents later described as an extensive surveillance detection route. He walked to the subway, rode several stops. He exited, waited on the platform as if he had exited accidentally, boarded another train, rode it in the opposite direction, exited again, walked several blocks to a bus stop, boarded a bus, rode it for approximately 2 miles, exited, entered a department store through one entrance and exited through another, walked through a shopping mall, and eventually emerged onto a street in Midtown Manhattan approximately 2 hours after he had left his apartment. Multiple surveillance teams maintained contact with Sokolov throughout this route, rotating positions to avoid detection. When he finally appeared satisfied that he was not being followed, Sokolov walked to a restaurant on East 52nd Street called the Russian Tea Room. This was a well-known establishment that served Russian and Eastern European cuisine and was popular with both American and Soviet patrons, including Soviet diplomats, UN personnel, and members of the Russian émigré community. Sokolov entered the restaurant at approximately 10:15 p.m. Agents could not follow him inside without risking exposure, but they maintained external surveillance and used parabolic listening devices to monitor conversations through the restaurant's windows when possible. Sokolov was observed meeting with another man at a table in a relatively secluded corner of the restaurant. The second man appeared to be in his mid-50s, with gray hair and glasses. He was dressed in business casual attire, slacks, and a button-down shirt. Agents photographed the second man through the restaurant's windows, The photographs were later analyzed and compared against FBI databases of known or suspected intelligence officers, Soviet officials, and persons of interest in counterintelligence investigations. The analysis produced a tentative identification. The man appeared to be Mikhail Andreevich Petrov, a 54-year-old Soviet citizen who held the position of cultural attaché at the Soviet consulate in New York. Petrov had been under FBI observation for some time. His position as cultural attaché provided cover for what investigators assessed was his actual role as a senior KGB officer responsible for managing intelligence operations in the northeastern United States. Petrov had been in New York since 1976, and during that time, the FBI had documented numerous contacts between him and individuals who were either known intelligence assets or were under investigation for possible espionage activities. The meeting between Sokolov and Petrov at the Russian tea room lasted approximately 90 minutes. When they departed, they left separately, Petrov first, followed approximately 15 minutes later by Sokolov. Surveillance teams tracked both men. Petrov returned to the Soviet consulate building on East 91st Street. Sokolov took another circuitous route, eventually returning to his apartment in Queens, arriving at approximately 1:30 a.m. Electronic surveillance of Sokolov's apartment picked up a telephone call he made at approximately 2 a.m. The call was to a number that the FBI had previously identified as belonging to another Soviet UN employee. The conversation was brief and was conducted in Russian. The FBI translation indicated Sokolov said something to the effect of "the situation has been discussed and new arrangements will be made." The person on the other end acknowledged this, and the call ended. The FBI now had evidence that Sokolov was involved in intelligence activities and was reporting to Petrov. But the key question remained. Who were the Americans mentioned in the microfilm documents? Who was engineer, professor, and diplomat? The breakthrough came from analysis of the microfilm itself rather than from surveillance. Technical specialists examining the photographed documents noticed something unusual about one of the pages. In the margin of the document that profiled engineer, there was a faint marking that appeared to be a fingerprint or a smudge. The image quality was poor because the marking had been captured when the original document was photographed to create the microfilm, but it was distinctive enough that specialists thought they might be able to enhance it. Using digital image enhancement technology that was relatively new in 1981, FBI technicians were able to isolate and clarify the marking. It was indeed a fingerprint, a partial print showing ridge patterns consistent with a thumbprint made in what appeared to be ink or possibly carbon from typewriter ribbon. Fingerprint analysis was a well-established forensic technique, but matching a partial print from a photographed image to an individual required both technical skill and access to fingerprint databases. The FBI maintained extensive fingerprint files on individuals who had been arrested, who had served in the military, who had applied for security clearances, or who had been fingerprinted for other official purposes. The partial print from the microfilm was compared against the FBI's fingerprint database. The search took several days, as computers in 1981 were not yet capable of the automated fingerprint matching systems that would be developed in later decades. Instead, trained fingerprint examiners conducted manual comparisons, focusing on files of individuals who fit the profile described for engineer, men in their 40s working in defense industries with security clearances. On August 14, 1981, FBI fingerprint examiner Dorothy Washington identified a match. The partial print from the microfilm matched the fingerprints of a man named Andrew Paul Novak, a 44-year-old electrical engineer who worked for a company called Aerospace Dynamics Corporation, located in Paramus, New Jersey. Novak's fingerprints were on file because he held a secret-level security clearance, which required fingerprinting as part of the background investigation process. Bureau records showed that Novak had been granted his security clearance in 1974. His employer, Aerospace Dynamics Corporation, was a defense contractor that designed and manufactured communications systems, radar components, and electronic warfare equipment for military aircraft. Employment records obtained by the FBI indicated Novak held the position of senior systems engineer and had access to technical specifications and design documents for several classified projects. Novak's personal background matched many of the details in the engineer profile. He was 44 years old, exactly as described. He lived in Teaneck, New Jersey, with his wife, Margaret, and their 2 teenage children. Financial records showed that Novak's wife had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 1979 and that the family had accumulated significant medical debt, approximately $42,000 based on credit reports and hospital records. The FBI obtained authorization to place Andrew Novak under surveillance on August 15, 1981. For the first week, his activities showed nothing suspicious. He commuted from Teaneck to the Aerospace Dynamics facility in Paramus, worked his regular hours, stopped at grocery stores, attended his children's school events, took his wife to medical appointments. He drove a 7-year-old Ford station wagon and appeared to lead a conventional suburban life. Then, on August 23, 1981, a Sunday, Novak left his house at approximately 2:30 p.m. and drove into New York City. He parked near the American Museum of Natural History on the Upper West Side and entered the museum. Agents followed him inside. Novak spent approximately 45 minutes walking through various museum exhibits. He appeared to be alone and did not interact with anyone in a way that suggested a planned meeting. Then, at approximately 3:45 p.m., while in the Hall of Ocean Life beneath the museum's famous blue whale model, Novak sat on a bench and appeared to wait. At approximately 4 p.m., a man approached and sat on the same bench, leaving approximately 2 feet of space between himself and Novak. Agents photographed the man from a distance. He appeared to be in his late 30s, with dark hair and a thin build. He wore casual clothing, jeans and a polo shirt. The 2 men did not speak directly or acknowledge each other in any obvious way. They sat on the bench for approximately 5 minutes. During this time, the second man appeared to be reading a museum brochure. Then he stood, left the brochure on the bench beside him, and walked away. Approximately 2 minutes after the man had departed, Novak picked up the brochure, placed it in his jacket pocket, stood up, and left the museum. Surveillance teams tracked both men. The second man walked out of the museum, hailed a taxi, and directed the driver to an address in Queens. Agents followed the taxi to an apartment building on Steinway Street in Astoria. The man entered the building, and investigators later determined from building records that the apartment he entered was leased to a man named Peter Davidovich Kulikov, a 37-year-old Soviet citizen who worked at the Soviet UN mission as an administrative assistant. Like Sokolov and Petrov, Kulikov fit the familiar pattern: Soviet diplomatic cover, military intelligence background, suspected KGB affiliation. The museum brochure that had been left on the bench and picked up by Novak was a standard American Museum of Natural History information guide available free at the museum entrance. When agents later obtained a similar brochure to examine, they found nothing unusual about it. However, the exchange clearly fit the pattern of a classic brush pass. a brief, impersonal contact between an intelligence officer and an asset during which materials could be passed with minimal risk of detection. The FBI needed to determine what, if anything, had been concealed in the brochure. On August 28, 1981, 5 days after the museum encounter, agents conducted a search of Novak's residence while he was at work and his family was out of the house. The search was authorized by a secret warrant issued under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, a law enacted in 1978 that established procedures for conducting surveillance and searches in foreign intelligence investigations. The search team, which included specialists in covert entry and technical surveillance, spent approximately 3 hours methodically examining the house. In Novak's home office, located in a converted bedroom on the second floor, agents found a locked filing cabinet. Using specialized tools, they opened the cabinet without leaving obvious evidence of entry. Inside the filing cabinet, concealed beneath folders containing personal financial documents, agents found a manila envelope. The envelope contained several items: $3,000 in cash in $20 bills, a set of typewritten instructions on plain white paper, and 3 rolls of undeveloped 35mm film. The typewritten instructions appeared to be responses to questions about specific technical projects at Aerospace Dynamics. The questions were phrased in a way that suggested they had been posed by someone with significant technical knowledge who wanted detailed information about system capabilities, vulnerabilities, and operational parameters. Novak's responses provided that information, including references to classified specifications that he had access to through his security clearance. The 3 rolls of film were the most significant discovery. Agents photographed the rolls in place, then carefully removed them for later development and analysis. The agents restored the filing cabinet to its locked condition and departed the house, leaving no obvious sign that a search had occurred. The film was developed at the FBI laboratory in Washington. The images showed photographed documents, technical specifications, design diagrams, test results, and operational parameters for radar and communications systems that Aerospace Dynamics was developing for the U.S. Air Force. The documents were classified secret, and their unauthorized disclosure to a foreign power constituted espionage under federal law. The FBI now had evidence that Andrew Novak was actively engaged in espionage, that he was being handled by Soviet intelligence officers operating in New York, and that he had provided classified information that had likely been transmitted to the Soviet Union. The decision was made to continue surveillance while simultaneously pursuing the identities of Professor and diplomat. Analysts reviewing the microfilm documents noted that the profile of Professor contained enough specific details to narrow the search considerably. The individual was described as teaching international relations at a university in the Boston area, had traveled to the Soviet Union on academic exchanges, was in his early 50s, and had contacts with U.S. government policy circles. Agents contacted the Bureau's Boston field office and asked them to compile a list of professors matching this description. Within 2 weeks, Boston agents had identified 3 possible candidates. One of them, a 52-year-old professor named Dr. Richard Allen Whitmore, matched the profile with particular precision. Whitmore taught international relations at a prestigious university in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was a recognized expert on Soviet foreign policy and U.S. Soviet relations. He had traveled to the Soviet Union on academic exchange programs in 1976, 1978, and 1980. He served as a consultant to think tanks in Washington that advised the State Department and other government agencies on foreign policy matters. He published articles in policy journals and gave presentations at conferences attended by government officials and policymakers. Background research showed Whitmore had been born in 1929 in Philadelphia. He had served in the U.S. Army during the Korean War, then attended college on the GI Bill, earning a bachelor's degree in history followed by a master's and Ph.D. in international relations. He had begun teaching in 1959 and had built a distinguished academic career over more than 20 years. He was married to a woman named Eleanor, and they had 3 grown children. He lived in a house in Lexington, Massachusetts, an affluent suburb of Boston. His lifestyle appeared comfortable but not lavish, consistent with an academic's salary, supplemented by consulting fees and speaking honoraria. The FBI placed Whitmore under surveillance on September 8, 1981. For several weeks, his activities appeared entirely conventional, teaching classes, attending faculty meetings, working in his university office, giving lectures, attending academic conferences. He traveled to Washington, D.C. 3 times during this period for meetings at think tanks and policy organizations. On October 2, 1981, Whitmore took a train from Boston to New York. Agents maintained the familiar surveillance protocol as he arrived at Grand Central Terminal, exited the station, and walked to the New York Public Library's main branch on Fifth Avenue. He entered the library and spent approximately 90 minutes in the reading room, apparently conducting research. Then he left the library and walked to a restaurant on 42nd Street, where he had lunch alone. After lunch, Whitmore walked to Bryant Park, the green space behind the New York Public Library. He sat on a bench near the park's central lawn and appeared to be reading a newspaper. At approximately 2:45 p.m., a man approached and asked Whitmore for the time. Whitmore checked his watch and told the man it was 2:45. The man thanked him and walked away. To any casual observer, this interaction would have appeared completely innocent. But agents trained in surveillance and counterintelligence operations recognized it as a possible recognition signal, a brief, scripted exchange that allowed 2 people to confirm they were the right individuals for a clandestine meeting without revealing their connection to anyone observing. Approximately 5 minutes after this exchange, a different man approached Whitmore's bench and sat down. Agents photographed this second man from a distance. He appeared to be in his early 40s, well-dressed in a business suit. The 2 men appeared to engage in casual conversation, as if they were strangers making small talk while sharing a bench in the park. After approximately 10 minutes, Whitmore stood up, leaving his newspaper on the bench, and walked away. The second man remained on the bench for another few minutes, then picked up Whitmore's newspaper and left the park in a different direction. Surveillance teams tracked both men. Whitmore returned to Grand Central Terminal and took a train back to Boston. The second man walked several blocks to a parking garage, retrieved a car with New York diplomatic plates, and drove to the Soviet consulate building on East 91st Street. FBI files later revealed this man to be Alexei Borisovich Volkov, who held the position of second secretary at the Soviet consulate, another KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover. The pattern was becoming clear. The Soviet intelligence operation documented in the Microfilm involved multiple Soviet officers working in coordination to recruit, handle, and receive information from American assets. The network appeared to be compartmentalized, with different handlers managing different assets and using various methods to communicate and transfer materials, dead drops, brush passes, brief meetings in public places. Analysis of the newspaper that Whitmore had left in Bryant Park revealed nothing visible to the naked eye. However, when the newspaper was examined under ultraviolet light, faint markings became visible on one of the inside pages. The markings appeared to be handwritten notes made with a special ink that was invisible under normal light, but fluoresced under UV illumination. The notes were brief and cryptic, using what appeared to be coded language. They referenced upcoming policy discussions, mentioned names of government officials, and made comments about internal debates within the administration regarding arms control negotiations. The notes did not contain classified information in the legal sense. Nothing was marked as secret or confidential, but they provided insights into U.S. government thinking and policy deliberations that would have been valuable to Soviet intelligence analysts trying to understand American intentions and predict future policy decisions. The FBI's assessment was that Whitmore was likely not a traditional spy, but what intelligence professionals call an agent of influence, someone who provided information willingly without fully recognizing the manipulation. His background supported this. He had a long record of advocating for improved U.S.-Soviet relations, for arms control agreements, and for diplomatic engagement. He genuinely believed that sharing information and promoting dialogue reduced the risk of miscalculation and war. His Soviet contacts had apparently cultivated this relationship carefully, framing their requests as scholarly exchange rather than espionage, allowing Whitmore to rationalize his cooperation as serving peace rather than betraying his country. The third individual mentioned in the microfilm, diplomat, proved more difficult to identify. The profile was fragmentary and provided few specific details. The person was described as having access to State Department communications, but whether this meant they worked for the State Department directly or had access through some other connection was unclear. Counterintelligence specialists reviewed the information available and developed several hypotheses. Diplomat could be a Foreign Service officer who had been recruited by Soviet intelligence. Diplomat could be a support staff member, a secretary, translator, or communications specialist who had access to classified cable traffic. Diplomat could be someone outside the State Department who received information from someone inside, a journalist, academic, or consultant who had a source willing to share information. The FBI reviewed recent espionage cases and ongoing investigations to see if any matched the diplomat profile. One case that seemed potentially relevant involved a State Department employee named William Henry Brennan, a 48-year-old communications officer who worked in the department's operations center, where classified cables from U.S. embassies around the world were received and distributed. Brennan had been under investigation since early 1981, following reports from co-workers that he appeared to be experiencing financial difficulties and had made comments suggesting frustration with his career prospects. The FBI had conducted a preliminary inquiry but had not found sufficient evidence to justify intensive surveillance. The discovery of the microfilm prompted a reassessment of the Brennan case. On October 15, 1981, the FBI placed Brennan under renewed surveillance. Within a week, agents observed behavior that raised significant concerns. On October 21st, Brennan left the State Department building during his lunch break and walked to a branch of the Library of Congress on Capitol Hill. He entered the library and spent approximately 30 minutes in the reading room. When he left, agents observed that he had left a book on the desk where he had been sitting, not returned to the shelves, but left conspicuously out. Agents entered the library after Brennan had departed and examined the book. It was a standard reference volume about international organizations. Between pages 247 and 248, agents found a small piece of paper with handwritten notes. The notes appeared to reference classified State Department cable traffic related to ongoing diplomatic negotiations. The FBI confiscated the paper as evidence and kept the library under surveillance. Approximately 2 hours after Brennan had left, a man entered the library, went directly to the desk where the book had been left, picked up the book, extracted the note from between the pages, replaced the book on the shelf, and left the library. Agents photographed this man and tracked him as he left the library. He walked several blocks to a parking lot, retrieved a car with diplomatic plates registered to the Soviet embassy, and drove to the embassy compound in northwest Washington. FBI files later identified the man as Dmitry Nikolaevich Kravchenko, a 39-year-old Soviet diplomat who held the position of Cultural Affairs Officer at the Soviet embassy, yet another KGB officer working under official cover. By late October 1981, the FBI had identified 3 American citizens, Andrew Novak, Richard Whitmore, and William Brennan, who appeared to be providing information to Soviet intelligence officers operating in the United States. The evidence against Novak was strongest, including the classified documents found photographed on film in his possession and the cash payment suggesting he was being compensated for espionage. The cases against Whitmore and Brennan were more circumstantial but still substantial. The decision was made to move forward with arrests. The timing was coordinated to occur simultaneously to prevent any of the suspects from being alerted by news of the others' arrests. On the morning of November 3, 1981, FBI agents arrested Andrew Novak at his home in Teaneck, New Jersey, Richard Whitmore at his university office in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and William Brennan at his apartment in Arlington, Virginia. All 3 men were charged with espionage-related offenses under federal law. Novak was charged with unauthorized communication of national defense information to a foreign government, a charge that carried a potential sentence of life imprisonment. Whitmore and Brennan were charged with conspiracy to commit espionage and with unauthorized disclosure of classified information. The arrests were followed by searches of the suspects' residences and workplaces. At Novak's house, agents found additional rolls of undeveloped film containing photographs of classified documents, along with $8,700 in cash hidden in the garage. At Whitmore's house, agents found correspondence with several Soviet academics who were later identified as intelligence officers, along with notebooks containing detailed notes about conversations with U.S. government officials and policymakers. At Brennan's apartment, agents found photocopies of classified State Department cables that he had evidently copied and removed from his workplace in violation of security regulations. The arrests were publicly announced on November 4, 1981. The FBI and the Department of Justice held a press conference in Washington describing the investigation and the charges. The announcement drew significant media attention, as espionage cases involving Soviet intelligence operations were matters of considerable public interest during the Cold War period. For the families of the arrested men, the impact was profound. Andrew Novak's wife, Margaret, learned of her husband's arrest when FBI agents arrived at their home at 6:30 a.m. on November 3rd. She had no knowledge of his espionage activities and was shocked to learn what he had been doing. Their 2 teenage children, a daughter, 16, and a son, 14, were awakened by the commotion of the arrest and struggled to understand what was happening. The family's financial situation, already precarious due to Margaret's medical expenses, became more dire. Andrew had been the primary income earner, and with his arrest and imprisonment, that income disappeared. Margaret was unable to work due to her illness, and the family quickly fell behind on mortgage payments and medical bills. They eventually lost their house and moved to a smaller apartment. The social stigma was equally damaging. Within days of the arrest becoming public, neighbors and acquaintances began avoiding the family. The Novak children faced harassment and bullying at school. Other students and even some teachers treated them with suspicion and hostility. Both children's academic performance declined sharply, and both reported symptoms of depression and anxiety in psychological evaluations conducted later. Richard Whitmore's family faced similar consequences. His wife, Eleanor, maintained that she had no knowledge of her husband's activities and believed he had been engaged in legitimate academic work. Their 3 adult children, all in their 20s, were living independently but found themselves dealing with questions and suspicions about their father's loyalty. Whitmore himself lost his university position, his academic reputation, and his consultancy work. Colleagues and friends distanced themselves, uncertain whether to believe he had been naively manipulated or had consciously betrayed his country. William Brennan was unmarried and had no children, but his arrest had significant impact on his elderly parents, who lived in Ohio. His mother, who was in her early 70s and in declining health, struggled to understand what her son had done and why. She died approximately 2 years after his arrest, and family members later said they believed the stress and shame of the situation contributed to her deterioration. The legal proceedings against the 3 men unfolded over the following months. Andrew Novak, facing the strongest evidence and the most serious charges, negotiated a plea agreement with prosecutors. In exchange for his cooperation with the ongoing investigation and his agreement to plead guilty, prosecutors recommended a sentence of 35 years in federal prison rather than pursuing a life sentence. During his cooperation debriefings, Novak provided extensive information about how he had been recruited and handled by Soviet intelligence. He described being first approached in 1979 at an electronics industry conference in Chicago. A man who identified himself as representing a European technology firm had expressed interest in Novak's work and had suggested they stay in contact. Over several months, this relationship had developed through occasional meetings and phone calls. The approach had been gradual. Initially, the contact had simply asked general questions about Novak's work, framed as market research for the technology firm. Then the questions had become more specific, and the contact had begun offering payment for information. First small amounts for what he characterized as consulting work, then larger sums for more detailed technical data. Novak claimed he had rationalized his cooperation by telling himself that the information he was providing was technical material that would eventually become publicly available anyway, and that the payments helped his family deal with the crushing medical debt from his wife's illness. He claimed he had not fully understood the implications of what he was doing until it was too late to extricate himself without facing consequences. Investigators assessed that this account was partially true, but also contained rationalizations. The evidence suggested Novak had known from relatively early in the relationship that he was dealing with Soviet intelligence, but had chosen to continue because the money was desperately needed and because he had convinced himself the harm was minimal. Richard Whitmore also eventually pleaded guilty, though he maintained throughout that he had not believed he was engaged in espionage and had thought he was participating in scholarly exchange that promoted peace and understanding. The evidence against him, the notes written in invisible ink, the coordination with known intelligence officers made this defense difficult to sustain, but prosecutors acknowledged that Whitmore appeared to have been manipulated more than he had been a willing spy in the traditional sense. Whitmore was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, a lighter sentence than Novak's, reflecting prosecutors' assessment that he had been less cognizant of engaging in espionage and had provided less sensitive information. William Brennan contested the charges against him and went to trial. The trial, held in federal district court in Washington, D.C., in the spring of 1982, presented the government's evidence of Brennan's meetings with Kravchenko, the notes left in the Library of Congress, and the photocopied State Department cables found in his apartment. Brennan's defense attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that Brennan had not intended to provide information to Soviet intelligence, but had been careless with classified materials, and that some of the classified documents in his apartment had been brought home accidentally as part of work he was doing outside office hours. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a guilty verdict on charges of unauthorized disclosure of classified information and conspiracy to commit espionage. Brennan was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The Soviet intelligence officers involved in the network, Sokolov, Petrov, Kulikov, Volkov, and Kravchenko, could not be prosecuted under U.S. law because they all held diplomatic status, granting them immunity. However, the State Department declared all 5 men persona non grata and ordered them to leave the United States. They departed within a week of the expulsion order, returning to the Soviet Union. What happened to these men after their return is not fully documented in available records. Intelligence officers who were expelled from foreign posts after being exposed sometimes faced consequences upon returning to the Soviet Union, their careers stalling or being reassigned to less prestigious positions. In other cases, particularly if they had successfully run productive operations before being caught, they were promoted or given other foreign assignments. The investigation's success led to changes in counterintelligence procedures and security protocols. The Department of Defense implemented enhanced monitoring of employees with security clearances, requiring more frequent security reviews and more extensive financial disclosure to identify individuals who might be vulnerable to recruitment due to financial pressures. The State Department tightened controls on classified cable traffic and improved auditing systems to detect when materials were being copied or removed from secure facilities. The FBI refined its procedures for surveilling Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover, developing new techniques for maintaining coverage while minimizing the risk of detection. The Department of Defense conducted a damage assessment to evaluate what classified information had been compromised. The assessment, completed in early 1982, concluded that Novak had provided the Soviet Union with detailed technical information about U.S. radar systems, communications equipment, and electronic warfare capabilities. This information would have allowed Soviet military planners and engineers to develop countermeasures and potentially to neutralize some advantages that U.S. forces possessed in these technological areas. The specific systems that Novak had compromised included early warning radar systems designed to detect incoming aircraft and missiles, secure communication systems used by military aircraft, and electronic warfare equipment designed to jam or deceive enemy radar and communications. The damage assessment estimated that the loss of this information had set back U.S. technological advantages by approximately 3 to 5 years, the time it would take to develop new systems incorporating different technologies and approaches that the Soviets would not have detailed information about. The assessment regarding William Brennan's disclosures of State Department cable traffic was more difficult to quantify. The cables he had provided contained information about U.S. diplomatic positions, negotiating strategies, and internal assessments of foreign governments and officials. This information would have given Soviet diplomats and policymakers insights into American thinking and intentions, potentially affecting negotiations and diplomatic interactions. However, diplomatic information typically has a shorter shelf life than technical data. What is valuable intelligence 1 month may be irrelevant the next, as circumstances change. The assessment of Richard Whitmore's activities was the most ambiguous. The information he had provided consisted primarily of his personal observations and insights about U.S. policy discussions and government officials' thinking. Much of this information was not formally classified, but it provided context and understanding that would have been valuable to Soviet analysts trying to predict U.S. policy directions. The damage was real, but difficult to measure in concrete terms. Andrew Novak served 28 years of his 35-year sentence. He was released on parole in 2009 at the age of 72, moving to a small apartment in Pennsylvania where he lived on Social Security and a small pension from his years working at Aerospace Dynamics before his arrest. His relationship with his children remained deeply strained. His daughter, who had been 16 when he was arrested, had married and had children of her own, but maintained minimal contact with her father. His son, who had been 14 at the time of the arrest, struggled with substance abuse problems for many years, problems that he attributed in interviews to the trauma of his father's arrest and the family's subsequent difficulties. Margaret Novak, Andrew's wife, died in 1993 from complications related to her multiple sclerosis. Andrew was permitted to attend her funeral under guard. The funeral was sparsely attended, and Andrew appeared devastated both by his wife's death and by the recognition that his choices had contributed to her suffering during the final decade of her life. Richard Whitmore served 12 years of his 15-year sentence before being released on parole in 1993. He was 64 years old. His academic career was over. No university would employ someone convicted of espionage, and his academic reputation was irrevocably damaged. He found work as a freelance writer and editor, producing educational materials and doing contract work for publishers. He lived quietly in a small town in Vermont until his death in 2007 at the age of 78. His wife, Eleanor, stood by him through his imprisonment and after his release, though their marriage was strained by the ordeal. In a 2005 interview conducted by a researcher studying Cold War espionage cases, Eleanor said that she had struggled for years to understand how her husband, whom she described as fundamentally a good and idealistic person, had allowed himself to be used by Soviet intelligence. She said she had eventually come to see him as someone who had been naive about the nature of his Soviet contacts and who had rationalized his cooperation as serving peace when it was actually serving the interests of a hostile intelligence service. William Brennan served 16 years of his 20-year sentence before being released in 1998. He was 64 years old. He moved to Florida and found work doing clerical and administrative jobs that did not require security clearances or background checks. He lived alone and maintained little contact with his family or with anyone who had known him before his arrest. He died in 2012 at the age of 78. The children of the arrested men bore a particularly heavy burden. The Novak children had been teenagers, at ages when peer relationships and social acceptance are particularly important, when their father was arrested and publicly identified as a spy. The stigma followed them for years. The older child, the daughter, changed her name after she married in an effort to distance herself from her father's crimes. The younger child, the son, struggled to establish a stable life and career, moving frequently and changing jobs often. The Whitmore children, who were adults when their father was arrested, faced different but still significant challenges. They dealt with questions from employers, colleagues, and acquaintances about their father's loyalty and whether they might pose security risks themselves. At least one of them was denied a security clearance for a job with a defense contractor, specifically because of the father's espionage conviction. The question of responsibility in cases like these is complicated because it requires assigning blame among individuals who were operating within systems and circumstances that shaped their choices. Andrew Novak bore responsibility for committing espionage. Yet he did so in circumstances of desperate financial need created by his wife's illness and the inadequacies of the American healthcare system in providing affordable treatment for chronic conditions. Richard Whitmore's provision of information came from a genuine belief that he was promoting peace and understanding, where his Soviet contacts framed their requests in ways that aligned with his idealistic beliefs, deliberately blurring the line between legitimate academic exchange and intelligence cooperation. William Brennan disclosed classified information in circumstances of career frustration and personal disappointment, where Soviet intelligence officers skillfully exploited his vulnerabilities and made their requests seem reasonable or justified. The Soviet intelligence officers who recruited and handled these men were professionals doing their jobs as they understood them, working to advance Soviet interests in the global competition with the United States. The FBI agents who investigated the case were professionals working to protect national security and to identify and neutralize foreign intelligence operations. All of these individuals contributed to outcomes that caused real harm to people who had little or no agency in the situation. The families of the arrested men who lost their financial security, their social standing, their sense of safety and normalcy. The small metal canister that Dennis Kowalski discovered beneath a bench in Battery Park on June 17, 1981, containing 17 photographed documents, set in motion a sequence of events that destroyed 3 families, sent 3 men to prison for decades, ended careers, disrupted lives, and created ripples of consequence that extended across years and touched dozens of people. Dennis Kowalski, the maintenance worker who found the canister, received a commendation from the FBI for his role in the investigation. He continued working for the New York City Parks Department until his retirement in 1991. In a brief interview he gave to a local newspaper in 1993, he said that he had never imagined when he picked up what he thought was a piece of trash that it would lead to such significant consequences. He said he was glad he had reported it rather than simply discarding it or ignoring it. The larger question raised by this case is what the discovery and prosecution accomplished. From a legal and national security perspective, the answer is relatively clear. 3 individuals engaged in espionage were identified, arrested, prosecuted, and punished. A Soviet intelligence network was disrupted. Classified information that had been compromised was identified so that defensive measures could be taken. Security procedures were improved to reduce the likelihood of similar breaches in the future. But from a human perspective, the accounting is more complex. 3 men who made bad choices spent decades in prison. Their families suffered consequences they did not deserve. The classified information that was compromised helped the Soviet Union understand and potentially counter U.S. military capabilities. But whether that actually affected any specific military or strategic outcomes is impossible to determine with certainty. The Cold War that provided the context for these events ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The ideological competition between capitalism and communism that had motivated much of the espionage activity of the preceding decades became largely moot. The specific information that Novak, Whitmore, and Brennan had provided became obsolete as technologies advanced and as the strategic situation transformed. What remained was the human wreckage, the damaged lives, the broken families, the years lost to imprisonment, the children who grew up in the shadow of their parents' crimes, the spouses who struggled to understand how their partners had lived double lives. Andrew Novak was 44 years old when the microfilm packet was discovered. He was 72 when he was released from prison. Richard Whitmore was 52 when arrested and 64 when released. William Brennan was 48 when arrested and 64 when released. Each of them lost the prime years of their adult lives, decades when they might have watched their children grow up, pursued their careers, enjoyed their relationships, contributed to their communities. The microfilm packet sits in FBI storage, a small metal canister that once contained information about an intelligence operation, but now serves primarily as a reminder that every espionage case, every investigation, every arrest and prosecution involves human beings making choices and bearing consequences, and that those human dimensions extend far beyond what any piece of evidence can capture or any legal proceeding can fully account for.